On a quiet flight across the country, a young woman sneered at an old soldier, mocking his faded, worn-out uniform for all to hear. But just when it seemed the moment would pass without consequence, the cockpit door opened, and the captain himself stepped into the aisle. What he did next left every passenger frozen in shock, and what happened after will change the way you see respect forever. Stay with us, because you won't believe how this story ends. Welcome to TNM Incredible Story. Let's uncover what really happened. The early morning sun poured through the airplane's windows, casting long golden beams across the rows of half-asleep passengers. Some were lost in their phones, some already dozing off, while others simply stared blankly ahead, waiting for the long flight to be over. In seat 14A, near the window, an elderly man sat quietly, his presence almost invisible to the busy world around him. His name was Thomas Miller. At 75 years old, his frame had grown thinner, his hands more fragile, but his eyes still carried the weight of a life few could imagine. He wore a faded military uniform, not for show, but because it was the most respectful thing he owned. Pinned on his chest were several medals, their shine dulled by time, but still telling a story of courage and sacrifice. Clutched tightly in his weathered hands was an old black-and-white photograph of a group of young men, his brothers in arms, frozen forever in their youth. Thomas wasn't heading to a grand ceremony or a parade. He was simply flying to visit the grave of his best friend, who had passed away 2 months earlier, one of the last of their band of brothers. As he sat there, he pulled his cap lower over his forehead, partly to shield his tired eyes, partly to hide the worn insignia that once symbolized so much. He knew how the world saw old soldiers now, relics of a past most people wanted to forget. He didn't expect smiles. He didn't expect gratitude. He just hoped for silence. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as passengers continued boarding. Thomas turned his gaze to the clouds outside, his mind drifting back to jungles and gunfire, to the faces of friends he hadn't seen in decades. A sharp voice jolted him back. Ugh, seriously? This seat? Next to that, the young woman muttered under her breath, loud enough for Thomas and nearby passengers to hear. She slid into the seat beside him with an exaggerated sigh, her expensive handbag brushing against his knee. Thomas offered her a small, polite nod. "Morning, ma'am," he said softly. The woman didn't respond. She pulled out her phone, tapping furiously, then gave a glance sideways, a glance full of judgment. "Why are they even letting people dressed like that fly?" she whispered to no one in particular, shaking her head. Thomas heard her. Of course he heard. But he only tightened his grip on the old photograph in his lap and looked back out the window. "Some people just can't let go of the past," she added, rolling her eyes. Thomas exhaled slowly, silently. If only she knew. If only she understood what that past had cost. In the reflection of the window, Thomas caught a glimpse of himself, the deep lines etched into his face, the frayed threads of his uniform, the fading memory of a younger, stronger man. He blinked once, twice, and turned his mind back to the clouds, determined to endure the journey without bitterness. Because he had learned something long ago. Real strength wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It endured. Quietly. The plane rumbled as the last few passengers settled into their seats. The young woman next to Thomas, Jessica, shifted impatiently, crossing her arms and tapping her manicured nails against the armrest. She glanced sideways again, her eyes narrowing at the sight of his battered uniform. "Seriously, it's 2025. Who even wears that anymore?" she muttered, just loud enough. Thomas didn't react. He had heard worse. In another lifetime, in another jungle, worse words had been hurled at him by enemies who didn't hesitate to back words with bullets. Jessica, emboldened by his silence, pulled out her phone. She opened her social media and began typing furiously, her lips curling into a smirk. "Stuck next to some old war hero. Smells like mothballs and ancient history," she posted, attaching a sneaky photo she had snapped of Thomas when he wasn't looking. The plane began its taxi toward the runway. Flight attendants moved briskly through the aisles, checking seat belts, closing overhead bins. Thomas shifted slightly in his seat, trying to make himself even smaller. He caught a glimpse of Jessica's screen out of the corner of his eye, the photo, the caption. He said nothing. He simply bowed his head a little lower. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in business attire noticed. He frowned but said nothing. Rose back. A teenage boy spotted the old uniform and nudged his mother, whispering, "Mom, he's a soldier," with admiration lighting up his young face. But Jessica didn't notice. Jessica didn't care. In her world, everything was new, flashy, fast. Heroes wore designer clothes, drove sports cars, and flaunted their success online. There was no room for battered uniforms, faded medals, or worn hands trembling slightly over a cherished memory. As the engines roared and the plane lifted off the ground, Jessica leaned closer to Thomas, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "So," she said, as if starting polite small talk, "what? Did you lose a bet or something? Wearing that get-up in public?" Thomas turned to her slowly. For a moment, their eyes met. In his, there was no anger, no shame, only a quiet sadness. "No, ma'am," he said gently. "I wear this to remember." Jessica blinked, confused, but before she could ask more, the captain's voice crackled over the loudspeaker. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," the captain began. "This is your captain speaking. Before we reach cruising altitude, I'd like to take a moment to recognize a very special passenger aboard today's flight." Jessica raised an eyebrow, uninterested. She pulled her earbuds out of her purse, preparing to drown out whatever boring announcement was coming. But what she heard next made her freeze. "Today, we are honored to have with us Sergeant First Class Thomas Miller, a decorated veteran who served with extraordinary courage during the Vietnam War. Sergeant Miller saved the lives of 32 of his fellow soldiers in one of the most dangerous battles fought overseas. We are grateful for his service and for the freedoms he helped protect for all of us." The cabin fell utterly silent. Jessica's earbuds slipped from her fingers. Her face drained of color. She looked at Thomas again, really looked, and for the first time, she didn't see a frail old man in a wrinkled uniform. She saw someone who had once stood between death and 32 young lives. Someone who had risked everything for people he barely knew. People like her. She swallowed hard, her earlier contempt crashing into shame so overwhelming it burned her cheeks. Around them, murmurs of respect filled the cabin. A few passengers clapped softly. Some simply bowed their heads. Jessica sank lower into her seat, wishing she could disappear. And Thomas? Thomas simply nodded once, humbly, his hand still gently cradling the old photograph. No bitterness. No pride. Just a quiet, dignified acceptance. The airplane leveled out at cruising altitude. But the tension around seat 14A felt anything but calm. Jessica sat rigid, her hands clutching the seatbelt, her mind racing. Every word of the captain's announcement echoed inside her skull, louder than the engines outside. Saved 32 lives? Vietnam War veteran? She dared a glance at Thomas, but he wasn't paying her any mind. He was staring out the window again, his eyes far away, lost in memories only he could see. Jessica's throat tightened with a strange mix of shame and guilt, emotions she wasn't used to feeling. Just then, the seatbelt signs chimed off. Passengers began to move, murmuring in small, respectful groups. A few leaned toward Thomas and whispered a quiet, "Thank you," their faces full of gratitude. Thomas simply nodded back each time, offering a humble smile, as if he didn't quite know what to do with the sudden attention. Then, something happened that nobody expected. The cockpit door opened. Out stepped the captain himself, a tall man in his late 40s, wearing his crisp uniform with pride. He didn't walk briskly down the aisle as most captains would. He walked slowly, deliberately, his eyes scanning the cabin until they landed on Thomas. Passengers turned to watch. Jessica froze, holding her breath. The captain approached Thomas's seat, stood at attention. And then, right there, in the narrow aisle of a commercial airplane, thousands of feet above the earth, he saluted. A full, perfect military salute. Sharp, precise, filled with respect. The cabin fell utterly silent again. Even the babies stopped crying, as if the entire world were holding its breath. Thomas blinked in surprise, then slowly, with trembling fingers, returned the salute. "Sir," the captain said in a voice thick with emotion, "it is an honor to have you on my flight. Men like you paved the way for men like me." Thomas looked up at him, his voice barely a whisper. "No honor needed, son. Just keep flying free." A lump formed in Jessica's throat. Tears blurred her vision. The captain nodded, then extended his hand. Thomas shook it, his frail grip firm with unspoken strength. Applause erupted across the cabin, not the polite kind, but the kind that came from deep within people's souls. Passengers stood, heads bowed. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Jessica sat frozen, feeling smaller than she ever had before. How could she have been so blind? How many sacrifices had been made by hands like Thomas's, hands she had so casually brushed aside? She wanted to say something, anything, but words stuck in her throat. Instead, she simply sat there, silent, while the man beside her, a true hero, returned to his quiet contemplation, unmoved by the sudden adoration around him. He hadn't boarded the plane looking for gratitude. He hadn't asked for recognition. He had carried his memories quietly, just as he had carried his burdens for decades. And Jessica would never see the world the same way again. The flight attendants resumed their service, moving quietly through the aisles with trays of drinks and snacks. But the atmosphere on board was different now, reverent, almost sacred. Thomas quietly sipped a cup of black coffee, his hands steady now, as if the salute had restored something inside him. Jessica fidgeted in her seat. She wanted to say something. She needed to say something. But every time she opened her mouth, the weight of her shame pressed it closed again. She glanced at Thomas's weathered hands, the slight tremble that returned when he thought no one was watching. She saw the small medals pinned inside his jacket, worn thin at the edges from years of being touched, remembered. Jessica bit her lip, her eyes stinging. Finally, she mustered the courage to speak. "Sir," she began, her voice cracking. Thomas turned to her, his expression patient, kind, the same patience he must have offered frightened young soldiers decades ago. Jessica swallowed hard. I'm sorry," she said, barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. I judged you without even trying to understand." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, not judging, not angry, just seeing. "It's all right, young lady," he said softly. "Most people don't see what's not shining anymore." He smiled gently. "It's not their fault. They live in a world of noise and lights. They forget the quiet things that made it possible." Jessica felt tears spill down her cheeks. "But it was wrong," she whispered. "You deserved better." Thomas shook his head slowly. "I didn't wear this today to be honored," he said. "I wore it because my brothers can't." He tapped the photo gently. "They never made it home. I carry them with me. Always." Jessica wiped her eyes, overwhelmed by the depth of loss hidden behind his gentle words. She couldn't undo the cruelty she had shown, but maybe she could honor it now, quietly, without drawing attention. Jessica reached into her bag. She pulled out a small notebook, the one she usually used for her social media plans, her schedules, her perfect posts. And on the very first clean page, she began to write, not about herself, not about her day, but about Thomas, about sacrifice, about gratitude, a tribute from a young woman who had finally opened her eyes. When she finished, she tore the page carefully, folded it, and placed it gently on Thomas's tray without a word. Thomas glanced at it, then at her. Jessica met his eyes, and for the first time, there was no judgment between them, only understanding. He picked up the note, unfolded it slowly, and read. His eyes softened. His lips curved into a small, genuine smile. No more words were needed. Jessica sat back, her heart lighter, knowing that sometimes the greatest apologies were not shouted, but shown. And sometimes the greatest lessons came not from books or schools or lectures, but from quiet moments on airplanes, sitting beside men who carried history in their very bones. The hours drifted by, but for Jessica, time seemed to move differently now. Each minute spent beside Thomas felt like another page in a story she had almost missed, a story written in courage, loss, and quiet honor. Outside the window, the city lights began to twinkle in the growing dusk. The captain's voice returned, calm and professional, announcing their descent into the next airport. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and your tray tables are secured. And once again, to our special guest in seat 14A, thank you, sir." The passengers clapped again, softer this time, like a whispered prayer carried on the wind. Jessica looked over at Thomas. He had dozed off, his head resting lightly against the seat, the tribute note still clutched in his hand. She smiled, a small, reverent smile. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about herself, her schedule, her photos, her online followers. She was thinking about him, and about all the men and women who had walked similar paths, unseen and uncelebrated. The plane touched down smoothly. A soft thump, a brief jolt, and then the long, slow taxi toward the terminal. As the seatbelt sign chimed off, passengers rose and stretched, gathering their bags. Jessica hesitated. She didn't want to leave without saying goodbye. "Sir," she said gently, touching his shoulder. Thomas stirred, blinking awake. He smiled up at her, a little embarrassed. "Looks like I slept through the landing," he chuckled. "You deserve the rest," Jessica said warmly. She paused, searching his face. "Thank you for everything. Not just today, but everything you gave, even when nobody saw it." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, then nodded, a deep, solemn nod. "Remember this," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "Freedom isn't free. It's carried by those willing to bear its weight, and remembered by those willing to look deeper." Jessica swallowed hard, nodding. "I will," she promised. Thomas smiled again, a full, bright smile that erased decades from his face, and then slowly gathered his things. Jessica stepped aside, letting him move ahead in the slow procession toward the exit. As she followed, she noticed something she hadn't before. Passengers were clearing a path for him, heads bowed, hands touching hearts. A silent parade for a silent hero. When Thomas reached the jet bridge, the captain was there again, waiting. He saluted once more. Thomas returned it, sharp and proud. And then, with the slow dignity of a soldier who had never needed medals to define him, Thomas disappeared into the crowd. Jessica watched him go, her chest tight with emotion. She knew she would never forget him, never forget what he taught her, without lectures, without anger, but through simple, quiet grace. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, a single question echoed in her mind. How many heroes do we pass by every day, without ever knowing? And from that moment on, Jessica vowed she would never walk blind again. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to honor the quiet heroes around us. Subscribe for more true and inspiring stories like this. And tell us in the comments, have you ever met someone whose silent strength changed the way you see the world? Don't let their stories fade away. Together, let's remember, let's honor, and let's pass it on.